How free or unfree is India's media? Well, according to a latest report placed in the public domain by Reporters Without Borders, India's media is less free than the media in Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Somalia. I'm Barkha Dutt, you're with the Mojo story. Our focus today is on these new rankings that have created such a debate in India. India has slipped 11 places in the Press Freedom Index in the newest RSF report of 2023. As I mentioned, India ranks below the following countries that you see on your screen, including Pakistan and Afghanistan. Those rankings have led the foreign minister to lash out at the methodology of this survey. In fact, India is in the bottom 10 countries in the world when it comes to security for journalists. These are staggering figures, but are they fair figures? The report goes on to say that India's media is politically partisan. It talks about the concentrated ownership of media and the takeover of media channels by oligarchs, that's the word it uses, and speaks of concentration of media ownership, placing press freedom in India in a crisis. It also goes on to talk about the absence of diversity within newsrooms, saying it's mostly Hindu men from upper caste that hold senior positions. It also talks about the large spend by government on advertising in television, online, and of course in newspapers. And its report says that as of today, 10 Indian journalists are in detention. Now, this is a very, in some would say, provocative survey. It has generated a fierce amount of debate at home. It has caused the foreign minister to leap in and wade into the conversation. And on the broadcast today with four very interesting guests, we hope to separate fact from fiction, rhetoric from reality, and perhaps do that one thing that media shows in India rarely do, reach a consensus. So let's introduce our guests on our program today. Joining us is a veteran journalist and rights activist, Kalpana Sharma. It's good to see you always, Kalpana. Sadanand Dhume of the Wall Street Journal is with us. He had a scathing tweet on this report while otherwise expressing concerns about the state of media freedom in India. Also joining us on the program today for the first time, and we hope the first of many, is Salvatore Babones. He's a sociologist at the University of Sydney, and in the past has been extremely skeptical about other indices, global indices that have ranked India's democracy and the state of democracy poorly. And also joining us finally on the program is the ever-articulate Yogendra Yadav. He is a psephologist turned political activist, but is somebody I have great respect for because he often engages independently with the world of ideas and often questions dogma. And I hope that we can all do that on the program today. Now, we have the rankings before us. And as I mentioned, the foreign minister Jaishankar has called this index strange, designed to play mind games. Before I get first comments from all of you, let's listen to Jaishankar on the Press Freedom Index.
I saw some strange index which somebody had done, saying these are countries, press freedom in countries. Okay. I think I was amazed at our number, you know. I thought we had the most uncontrollable press. And I mean, somebody is getting something fundamentally wrong. So I found, I don't know, Afghanistan was freer than us. I mean, Afghanistan, can you imagine? I mean, where they actually, look, these are all, I mean, I see democracy index, freedom index, religious freedom index, press freedom index. These are all ways of playing mind games, of, you know, elevating somebody you like, doing down somebody you don't like. I think we have to absorb it, we have to combat it. I agree with you, we need to counter it. You know, even on human rights, I mean, we sometimes get lectures from individuals, countries or organizations. And, you know, my point is, there's no point in my saying I don't like it, or saying, well, you know, it's none of your business. Of course it's none of their business, but that's not good enough. I mean, I have to say, okay, I heard what you said, now please listen to what I have to say. So, I think today's India will not be at the receiving end of other people's judgment. If we will be equally judgmental, and I suspect many people will not like it.
Let me start with you, Sadanand, because you're your Twitter comment on this report said that Indian journalists sharing these findings uncritically were doing a disservice. You didn't use the word disservice. I'm summarizing, doing a disservice to this debate. That if we are really to have an honest debate about the quality of freedom of media in India, we can't be citing this report. Now, the report actually looks at 5 different indicators that it divides into: politics, society, economics, security, and so on. And I think we have them, and we'll bring that slide up in just a moment. What for you is the most problematic part of this report, according to you? And that being said, it's not that you're necessarily optimistic, I know from conversations otherwise, about the state of freedom of media in India. Sadanand.
Yeah, so Barkha, I mean, there are various reports floating about, and my general sense of this is that the RSF report is probably one of the shoddiest, just in terms of methodology, in terms of the most obvious flaws. Professor Babones has mentioned some of them, like the way they look at safety, for example. They don't do the sort of they look at the number of journalists. They characterize India as one of the least safe places, whereas in fact it may be one of the safest places. There's no role for complexity. But the sort of deeper problem, if I had to summarize it, is that they are simply unable. They don't have the resources, they don't have the intellectual resources or the capacity to make these very complex comparisons across countries. And so they end up coming up with sort of farcical findings, right? Now, I recognize that there are many problems with media freedom in India. I don't think that it passes an elementary smell test, as I pointed out in my tweet, to say that the Indian media is less free than the Afghan media, right? And so it's because they are trying to portray something that is fundamentally subjective, that as objective, that the rankings themselves are a farce. That's number one. The second point is that, if you just look at their methodology, it's a bunch of questions. And when you give people a bunch of questions, you're going to end up, your results are going to basically reflect the views of the people who answered those questions. Unfortunately, we don't know who those people are in RSF's context. And, just think of this in common sense terms, Barkha, right? Now, if you were to give the same survey to, say, somebody from an organization that is very, very pro-government, they would come back to you and tell you that the state of media freedom in India is better than Denmark. And if you were to give the same survey to people sort of who have who have exactly the opposite view, they would come back to you and tell you that India is worse off than Zimbabwe. I think there's some of that happening. If you look at some of the language, and I'll finish after this, they use terms like Godi media, they use terms like Bhakts, which are, I think it's, maybe okay if you're sort of a Twitter troll, if you're having an argument on, but I think doesn't sort of, to me, that detracts from the seriousness of a report. I would love to see, now here, this is where, you and I have a different view. I would love to see RSF come up with a serious study of the state of media freedom in India. I think it's good. I'm all for people who are looking in from the outside. But you have to do it with a certain amount of seriousness. You have to do it in a way that will be taken seriously. And this report, unfortunately, is just farcical.
So you believe the report is shoddy, its methodology is questionable, and it to that extent trivializes the genuine conversation around the state of media freedom in India. Would that be a fair summary?
It hurts the debate about media freedom because it comes up with such caricaturable findings that people who don't want to have this debate can simply point to those 2 or 3 findings and say, look how ridiculous this is. We don't need to have this conversation.
Yogendra Yadav, if I may bring you in now, before you became this full-time political activist and politician, you were a psephologist looking at numbers, surveys, opinion polls. This was your professional skill. I ask you this and I underline this because Sadanand questions the methodology. Professor Babones in other debates has questioned the methodology of other indices on democracy, and basically the argument seems to be that whoever you question, this is something very, very normative about this approach as opposed to empirical, because it all depends on who you identify to talk to. So if you talk to, let's say, Arnab Goswami, he's going to say the media is very free. And if you talk to Arundhati Roy, she is going to say that the media is completely captured. And those are the 2 extreme sort of individuals or maybe thoughts at either end of the ideological spectrum. Yogendraji, how do you see this report and how do you see the larger debate?
Barkha, first of all, I think we should underline and mention the fact that no one from that organization is on this panel. I believe not. Yes. And in that sense, there's something inherently unfair here. because if we are talking about methodology, if we are talking about bias and so on, it's only fair. I think, again, in terms of fairness of media, it's only fair that those who prepared the report should be here to defend it.
We did try and reach out, and I hope to be able to follow up with them. But do go ahead.
Yeah,
Yes.
so I think we should begin by acknowledging that elementary
Sure.
something absent in the program today.
Sure.
Second, I think Sadanand is absolutely correct to say that there is a subjective element here. Of course, yes. Every single index in this world is subjective. All the numbers that we talk, even GDP has a subjective element to it because you have to give weightage to different things. So, and the exams that we talk about, Barkha, on the basis of which all of us secured admission to universities, they are subjective too. Admission to universities is subjective. So most of the numbers that we look at in life are numeric expression of intuitions. So what Sadanand says is true, but unfortunately, it's more true about everything in the world than he probably means. 3, is it shoddy? I do not know. I would not be able to say that because, as I said, people who've prepared it should be here to defend it. And those who've actually done some research on this index over the years, they should be here to defend it. But I'll just say 2 things. Number 1, does it pass the smell test? That's an important thing, Sadanand, because in the last instance, these indices should intuitively make sense to those who are on the ground. I'm not a media person, but I meet media people every day. I interact with them every day. And Sadanand, one thing I can tell you, switch off the camera, ask anyone in the media today, so how are things? And he would say, oh my God, don't ask me, Yogendra. Kisi tarah naukri chala rahe. People call you at 12 o'clock. We are having a show this evening. Will you come for that, sir? It's on unemployment. It's on this, on that. You say, all right, I'll be there. At 4 o'clock, you get a call. Sorry, we've dropped it. There has been some Hindu-Muslim stuff. This happens. You heard about what happened to NDTV and Mr. Adani. I mean, you know about these things much better than I do, Sadanand. But let's stick to the smell test. And the smell test, to my mind, is speaking to an ordinary journalist in a small town India, or an ordinary journalist working in any of the Hindi newspapers or in any of the Kannada news channels and so on. And they would tell you things are bad, things have got worse, that it's very hard to practice honest journalism. And I was surprised when you talked about security. You said it's very safe to practice journalism in India. No, Sadanand, you must be speaking to people in Delhi. Please speak to people in small towns. Please speak to ordinary journalists. It is not safe, not only to be a journalist, it is not safe even to be an RTI activist in this country, provided you speak up. As you would know better than I do, freedom of speech has a meaning only if there is a freedom after speech. And there is very little freedom after speech in India. So intuitively, it makes sense. I would not be able to certify and say that all the numeric expressions in this report are good. I'm certainly in no position to compare Afghanistan and India. I've not been to Afghanistan. Why should I pretend to be able to judge that? But when the broad description that the report provides seems to make sense, broadly, it is saying we are below 40 marks, which is in the very bad category. Broadly, it places us along with Egypt, with Turkey, Russia, and Bangladesh. Seems to make sense to me. It puts us above Saudi Arabia, North Korea, China, Iran. It seems to make sense to me. So intuitively, it makes sense. No one can certify the numbers.
Okay, so 2 completely different perspectives. Sadanand, I want you to go to Salvatore. Do you have a very brief introduction? Please keep it very brief.
I just want to sort of clarify on one thing. Yogendra, I am not someone who says that there's no problem with media freedom. I've written several columns about this in the Wall Street Journal. But I do think that, we should call out what I think are ridiculous comparisons. Now, on the point about freedom, very quick, on safety, very quickly, Again, I'm not saying that horrible things don't happen. You could be covering a local mining baron in a small town in the Hindi heartland and end up dead the next day. I understand that there are serious concerns. All I'm saying is that the methodology as they use it, right, where they look at the numbers of deaths, and they look at a country the vastness of the size of India, you need to have a per capita element in this, right? I'm just looking at the RSF point. I'm not making a broader point that everything is hunky-dory in India. I would not say that, and I think it would be ridiculous to say that.
I do take Yogendra's point that we should have tried harder to get someone from the RSF on this program, and hopefully we'll have an opportunity to get them, give them a chance to actually to defend themselves. But Yogendraji, intuitively, for me, the relative comparisons is where something falters for me. To look at the Taliban that is pulling women off air, for example, in Afghanistan from television shows, that comparison doesn't hold, but there is a general anxiety about the state of media. I think that is a conversation we need to have, but also why it's happening. Is it business models? Is it broken revenue models? Is it, is it government? Is it government advertising? There are so many reasons we can talk about. Salvatore Babones, can we bring you in? Now, you had a very interesting graphic actually on your Twitter feed, which we're just going to show. Can we take the banner off and look at this carefully, please? I need the banner off. Yeah. This is annual journalist death per billion population in the period between 2014 to 2023. We look at the deaths in India, we look at the rest of the world, excluding China, and we look at the United States. And I think Professor Babones is making the point that, therefore, the United States, generally considered the free world, the leader of the free world, the leading country of the free world, has a higher percentage. Do you want to talk about those numbers and the larger debate? Professor Babones, go ahead.
Well, the U.S. does have a higher rate of journalist deaths, but the U.S. is a more violent country in general. So, for example, in addition to this chart, I've also calculated the journalist death rate in India per million population. Now, that's approximately 4.1 per million annually in India. Contrast that with the actual murder rate in India, which is 21 per million population. So in other words, journalists are only about 1/5 as likely to be killed in India as the general population is likely to be killed in India. Now, of course, we want nobody killed. We want that brought down to zero. But the real problem here is that we're not dealing with data. We're dealing with a survey. The survey is very poorly constructed. So I'll just give you an example. The safety rating on the data is the rating where India performs worst. In fact, India is rated 172 out of 180 countries for safety for journalists on the data. That's below, the usual suspects. But Somalia, Iraq, Afghanistan, Russia, North Korea, Democratic Republic of the Congo, which is one of the least safe countries in the world, Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, Hong Kong, the list goes on of countries that perform better on this survey. But you have to look at what are the actual questions on the survey. So, a series of questions that Indian journalists might very reasonably answer the bad answer on each one. Have any journalists been assaulted in the last 12 months? Well, in a country of 1.4 billion people, some journalist has been assaulted in India in the last 12 months. Have any journalists been suffered cruel or degrading treatment? Yes, somebody in all of India in the last 12 months has suffered cruel treatment. Have any journalists been murdered? Well, yes, every single year there is at least one journalist murdered in India. Now, that's terrible, but just on the odds, we would expect far more journalists to be killed in India. That is, just if they were being killed at random, like the general population, we would expect more journalists to be killed in India. And in fact, if you go to the details from the Committee to Protect Journalists of the journalist deaths, about half of them are not actually necessarily killed for their journalism. That is, they are often killed. There's a murder. It's not clear whether the murder was a murder of the journalist as a journalist or if it was a murder just of a person who happened to be a journalist.
If I may interrupt you, the CPGA report, the Committee to Protect Journalists report that you cite said that the journalists were killed off the clock. That doesn't necessarily mean that they weren't killed for their work. Salvatore, can we unmute him, please? Hang on, give me a second. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
I'm saying that it's not always clear, especially in a case where most of the journalist deaths being recorded are deaths of independent journalists. Now, I know we have an independent journalist in the panel here. Of course, I want independent journalists to be safe. But it's not always clear that an independent journalist is a journalist as such. So we end up with this figure that's shocking. India is 172nd. There are only 8 countries in the world that are less safe for journalists than India. But this is an artifact of the way the survey has been constructed, of India's large population, and the fact, and this is something I really want to emphasize to people, that India is the only bona fide democracy in the bottom half of this table. That is, when you look for countries that are relatively poor, all of sub-Saharan Africa, most of South Asia, the entire Middle East, it's hard to find democracies, with the result that in countries where people can freely report, well, India among those countries is relatively low. That is, if you're comparing India to Switzerland, most of Western Europe to the US, yeah, safety in India may be compromised. However, India is not being compared to those countries. India is being compared to countries where there's no freedom to report. Well, in those countries, do we know about the journalist deaths? If a journalist is killed in the jungles of Papua New Guinea, is that making it into our statistics? I suspect not. I suspect India's results appear worse precisely because India is a country that has an independent media.
Okay. Kalpana, let me bring you in. I think there's a lot to discuss in the points already made. As an independent journalist, as someone who has expressed serious concern about what is happening to the state of press freedom, can I first ask you what it's due to? Because I think Yogendra cited, for example, the takeover of NDTV by Gautam Adani. Most television channels today are owned by big business houses, but the Washington Post is owned by Jeff Bezos. What I'm trying to say is everywhere in the world, the media is in a crisis over one reason. How do you get news to be self-sustaining? So when we talk about government advertising, when we talk about oligarchs, when we talk about broken revenue models, this may not be unique to India. I've just been in the United States where two big media outlets, Vice News, Global Feed, and BuzzFeed's news outlet actually shut shop because they couldn't sustain. So I think how do we link them back to the larger democracy debate, and should we be linking them back is the question.
Thanks, Barkha. First of all, let me say you started off by saying there was a passionate debate about this report in India. Frankly, no, there has not been. Yours is one of the first programs. I have been monitoring newspapers. I have not seen any critique either of the report or what it suggests that we should be talking about the state of media freedom in India, irrespective of the RSF report. As I see it, that's a trigger for us to be really discussing where we are at now in India. And if the RSF report says we've slipped 11 points, well, you can discuss till you're blue in the face whether it is a good methodology or not, or Jaishankar can say it's a strange report. But the reality for journalists, as Yogendra was saying, is that things have changed drastically in the last 9 years. I've been a journalist for 50 years, and I have worked right through mainstream media. So I do know structures. I do know that the media houses that I worked for were privately owned, and they were under pressure from various governments, even in the past. So that's nothing new. But I think now we've reached a point where it's like, there's like a uniformity in the way the media presents anything. And the ones that stand out are the small independent platforms, most of which are digital, and a few others. And so you find that there are vast areas of what's going on in this country that are never reported. The journalists who are trying to do it using RTI, using other ways, either cannot find an outlet or are under threat. And we don't know about it. Those of us who are metro-based don't make the effort to actually find out the conditions under which these people work. And Barkha, and I know that many of the big stories, for instance, I know that came out in the 80s were because of these journalists who were based in the rural areas, in small towns, who managed to get it out.
I agree. I fully agree with you.
I fully that has changed. And sorry, let me finish. That has changed. Combination of two things. One, of course, the economics of it.
Yes.
So many things have died down. So more and more concentration is on the big Noida-based television channels and the large newspapers, which also are headquartered mainly in Delhi. So as a result, in a vast country like this, you get a sort of tunnel vision of what is going on, and only those things that will help sell the product. This is one of the shocks that came to me when I worked with one particular media house, when the managing director told us, we were a product, we were a brand, and we were brand managers as journalists who were to sell it. Anyway, that's another story. But the second thing is, I think this government since 2014 has managed to use this particular structure that has always been there, which has been used by previous governments, to a much greater extent. And I think that is what you see now in the fact that, as I said, obvious stories that ought to be followed up are not followed up. I know from my own experience of talking to journalists that they have tried to follow up and they have not managed either within their media houses or as independent journalists to place those stories.
I was just, if I may say now, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I was just going to say that I completely agree that there is diminished budgets, resources, energy focus on reporting. But I sometimes wonder that is the real crisis that media houses are not able to sustain themselves. Therefore, you become dependent on business houses. Business houses, in turn, are dependent for other businesses on friendly government policies, and therefore will not allow a kind of freedom in the newsroom that perhaps previously could have been allowed. I don't know. I'm just putting the question out there that sometimes we overlook the economics and we focus too much on politics. But of course, we can join the dots between the two. Let's take what you've said to Salvatore, Babones, and then Yogendra, and then Sadanand in that order. Go ahead, Professor Babones. One of the points you have repeatedly made, even in indices on the state of democracy, is it all depends on who you talk to. But if I were to pick up, therefore, two anecdotal examples, the ban on the BBC documentary recently, and then raids that many people did not see as unconnected, and a journalist who goes to cover a gang rape in Uttar Pradesh, Siddiq Kapan, and he gets arrested and clubbed and is called an alleged, is accused of having links with terror groups. These are the kind of big headline grabbing anecdotal examples that if the RSF came to survey people, they would cite. And as anecdotal examples, they sound like big giant examples. And hence the questionnaire perhaps ends up being what it is. But these are not irrelevant examples that I've given. They speak to something. We need to talk about what they speak about. Go ahead.
But this is to misunderstand how surveys work. The text write-up, that's the headline grabbing part of the report, yes, that comes from these anecdotes. But the surveys are actually a series of quantitative measures. And India's misplacement on these surveys is longstanding. It doesn't result from the last 9 years. I mean, let me quote you from the 2012 report. In India, the, quote, world's biggest democracy, unquote, they don't want to say that it really is, the authorities insist on censoring the web and imposing more and more taboos, while violence against journalists goes unpunished. Yeah, I'll read from the 2013 report. India experienced an unprecedented wave of violence against journalists, with 8 killed in 2013. They're targeted by both state and non-state actors. Almost no region is spared. This is not a BJP thing. This is not a Modi thing. This is a problem that India has as an entire national community with the way these surveys are conducted. And the fundamental problem is that if you were to rank democracies and you were to say India falls below Western Europe, North America, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, that would just put it at number 40 or 50. That'd be fine. No one would argue over it. The problem is these surveys are not designed to properly measure non-democracies, with the result that all of these non-democracies, North Korea scoring better than India on some of these metrics, Democratic Republic of the Congo. The problem is that the survey is not well designed to capture the difference between life in a real liberal democracy with a real press freedom and a dictatorship or a disorganized country that has no real democracy. As a result, you get these bizarre results of Hong Kong being ranked 20 places above India for press freedom. How is that possible? It's possible. It's not because of these anecdotes. It's possible because of the way the survey is constructed.
Can you speak to the last point before I get Yogendra Yadav to come in? You're basically saying, if I understand you correctly, that there is no sort of access to that kind of open question and response in societies or countries that are more tightly controlled, that they're so tightly controlled that you can't even have this kind of subjective survey there. And therefore, the methodology of the survey you find questionable. Is it that, Professor Babones?
Oh, sorry, you're asking me? Yes, absolutely. Yes. The survey is simply not well designed to differentiate among poor countries that are democracies, because there are so few poor countries that are democracies. I mean, we just don't have the problem in Australia that journalists are killed by IEDs in separatist regions, right? That just doesn't happen in a country like Australia. And so the survey is not well designed to capture the reality of a poor country democracy.
Yogendra Yadav, let me actually bring you in at this point. I think it's fair to say that the Americans, let's take America as an example, which is a democracy. It has a Second Amendment, which has led to its gun violence. I think 150 sort of shootings just this quarter alone being out of control. But it has a very constitutionally rooted cultural idea of free speech. In India, By contrast, we've actually not had that. We've had an emergency under Indira Gandhi. We've had books banned under all parties and all governments. And we've had a kind of competitive politics around people being, for example, arrested for cartoons and Facebook posts. This have taken place on BJP governments, on Mamata Banerjee's watch, or on Sharad Pawar's watch. Is the problem that we do not, you think, that there is a kind of, smaller premium placed on free speech in India? What do you think is going on here?
Want in this program for us to focus on the real issue. Yes, we can talk about the structural problems of Indian culture. Yes, we've never actually valued freedom of speech very much. Yes, we can debate the business media links, which is a universal reality. Which has got slightly worse in the last 8-9 years, but that's a universal thing. Yes, we can debate the caste and gender composition of Indian media. It hasn't changed dramatically in the last 8-9 years, but I think as people who are seriously debating the freedom of press, can we talk about something real, tangible, and out there in the face? Its name is Modi government. Has something changed in this country in the last 8-9 years for the worse, for the media in this country, because of the kind of regime that we have? Is the government, those who are in political power, are they creating obstacles of an order which are substantially higher than they used to be? Is India much less free? Is Indian media much less free today compared to the past because of what the Modi regime is doing? Can we face this question in this program, or do we want to just skirt around it?
No, you're free to. Can you elaborate on what you think has changed since 2014? Because that's the argument you're making.
That's right. And then just to complete the point, the 2 points I wanted to make before I come back to answering you. There are 3 broad issues from this report. One, is the situation of the media bad in India? Is it alarming? Second, has it got worse than before in India? Third, how does India compare to 15 other countries in the world? To be absolutely honest, I have very little interest in the third question. As an Indian operating in India, I'm principally interested in the first 2 questions. And the answer to that is, yes, it's very bad. Yes, it's got worse. Yes, it's crossed alarming levels. And yes, it would be very hard to call India a bona fide democracy very soon.
Why do you say that? Why do you say that?
I love to hear professors from outside saying very nice things about my country, but not when they pass sweeping judgments. So I heard Professor Salvatore saying India is the only bona fide democracy in the bottom half of the Press Freedom Index. I just quickly looked at names. Sir, it includes Mexico, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Israel, Nepal, Chile. By your definition, these are not bona fide democracies, and only India is democracy. I love to hear nice things about my country, provided they have some element of believability built into that. I think the important question,
all of those have serious problems as democracies.
And not India.
And all of those countries are substantially richer than India.
I'm astonished to hear that all these countries have problems with democracy. The only country that does not have problem with democracy is India. How I love you, Professor. I think people like you must be given honorary citizenship if you haven't already been. But tell me, I mean, I really want to hear nice things about my country, provided they have some element of truth. There is no question about democracy in India. Believe me, Professor, I have been to universities abroad, world, giving them lectures on the success of Indian democracy. And believe me, today I don't have the face to go and talk about those things because of what's happening in my country. You may not be aware of those things, sir, but something is happening to democracy in our country. And to my mind, it's a circular argument to say freedom of press index cannot be very low in India, because India is a bona fide democracy, and India is a bona fide democracy because there is a freedom of press.
Okay,
Can we please stop this vicious cycle?
I think he's wanting to respond, but before that, I have to ask you a very brief question. You said you're in Karnataka right now. I know where elections are going to be held in a week. Surveys seem to suggest that the BJP is on the back foot in these elections, that this could actually go the way of the Congress party. We don't know, maybe. You made a comment just now that very soon we may not be a democracy, if I heard you right, Yogendra ji. You said very soon, or you said something about very soon we will, even our status as a democracy. I don't remember the exact words you used, but this was the essence of what you were saying. And I said, why do you say that? And I ask you that again, because you may talk about rights that exist between elections that you think are diminishing. But as an electoral democracy, we continue to be robust. Our elections are free and fair. Would you concede that, especially in a state where actually the election looks like it's going to flip for the BJP?
Barkha, I would invite your attention to a concept called electoral autocracy, which is all over the world now. India is not the only country that practices it. We are very steadily moving towards that. On Karnataka, can I tell you, because you spoke of surveys in Karnataka and we are discussing freedom of press. There's a largest survey that took place in Karnataka by an organization called Idina. The finding happened to say that Congress was winning it big time. Not a single news channel covered it. Not a single newspaper even reported it as a news item. When Prime Minister Modi was in Karnataka campaigning, and the same day Priyanka Gandhi was there. Do you know the proportion of coverage in the Kannada medium? 100 to 0. This is what I mean about challenges to freedom of press. If you look at Kannada media today, you are saying maybe Congress is expected to do well. I would suggest, Barkha, please ask someone to monitor Kannada channels today. And tell me, what do the channels say? And that to me would be a small example of the absence of freedom of press in India.
Okay, you made a lot of points. I think it's only fair, Sadanand, first Salvatore, then Sadanand, and then Kalpana. Salvatore, because there was a direct kind of interjection that it called for from him. Go ahead.
I gave you those quotes from 2012 and 2013 because I really want to educate Indians that this is not a BJP issue. This is not a last 9 years issue. This is not a Narendra Modi issue. And no matter who wins the 2024 election, no matter who goes on forward in Indian politics, this is an Indian image problem. The image problem existed before 2014. It seems like most Indians have now forgotten about that. What seems to me is that Indians like to weaponize these international reports against the current government, thinking that somehow they're making political capital by doing so. But while they do so, they're undermining their own country in the international sphere. I'm sorry to say that, but whoever takes control of India at the next election is going to face all these same problems, and these problems just aren't true. India was not the 140th freest press with rampant murders of journalists and rampant government interference in 2013, and it's not that today.
Sadanand, I think the absence of granularity in how the West understands or does not understand India has long been a kind of fault line in the India and Western world debate. And I think you have two completely different perspectives on this program. Is there a way to find a space that is in the middle of both of these positions? That everything is not brilliant?
I think there is a space that's in the middle, and I think that's a commonsensical space. I think you have to separate two different things. You have to separate the RSF report from the state of media freedom in India. If you're having a debate about the RSF report, I have to largely agree with Dr. Babones. The report is ridiculous. It's mostly ridiculous because out of the three questions that Yogendra Yadav listed, the third one it simply makes no sense. The sort of comparison across countries it's laughable. It's easy to poke holes in, right? And so the report itself, for the reasons we've discussed, is not a useful report. Now, does that mean that we can't have a serious and sober discussion about the media freedom in India? The problem I have with maybe not Dr. Babones himself, but many people who sort of take his arguments forward, is that they use those arguments to make the claim that this is all some part of some, machinations from abroad and everything is great in India. There's been no decline in media freedom. It was always, these reports were always saying these things. It didn't matter who was in power. That's disingenuous, right? And again, we can approach these questions with humility. We can sort of say that, look, I'm going to tell you what is my subjective opinion as someone who follows the Indian media closely, has written for the media for many years. I will say this. In my subjective view, there has been a palpable decline in Indian media freedom over the last 10 years. I think that there are certain things that people hesitate to say. If you have private conversations with journalists, I'm not talking about particularly ideological journalists. If you talk to sort of solid centrist journalists, they
Where
will
are
tell
where are
you.
these solid centrist journalists? You
I
know
can't take
that.
names of private conversations.
No. What I'm trying to say is that I believe that the Indian media has got Americanized in its political partisanship. You know that I believe this. I've said it openly. I call it the Chamcha Morcha syndrome. I believe most people are either supplicant to power or believe that they have to take a political position against this government. So they're activists. Where is the old classic idea of journalism?
Barkha,
Does it
I mean,
exist?
I love the Chamcha Morcha formulation, right?
Yes.
Absolutely. But I mean, let's be frank. Can you be on a mainstream Hindi news channel in India and have a program deeply critical of the Modi government? You can't. Let's be honest about this, right? There has been a palpable decline. Now, you could argue that things used to be things used to be unfree in the other direction if you go back 50 years to emergency and so on. And I think that's true. I would argue that, emergency was worse. And I think people who say that this is worse than emergency probably are exaggerating. But I think it is fair to say, again, I'm being very upfront about this. This is my subjective assessment. I think it's certainly true of most of the electronic media. It's certainly true of the Hindi media. There is a certain amount of fear. There is the sort of very organized way in which the government sends people after people who are critical. This is a very ugly thing that didn't exist in the past. So I think the concerns that people express are genuine and real concerns, and they should not be batted away merely because the RSF report is flawed, right? So that's my
Okay.
that's my
Okay.
first point. But can I so let me make that point.
Kalpana's
The
waiting.
point
So
I want to
briefly.
make is that
Yeah.
part of the problem also, and you alluded to this, is that there's no culture of media freedom even at the state level. And so
Yeah.
this is where, when you turn it into BJP versus not BJP, I'm not defending the BJP. I think the Modi government's record on media freedom is atrocious. Again, it's my subjective opinion. I believe it to be atrocious as someone who has observed and been part of the media for a long time. It is also true that several state governments have atrocious records, right? But those things don't cancel each other out. But we need to be able to address the elephant in the room, right? And the elephant in the room is that things have gotten bad. The way these reports approach this is ridiculous. They end up discrediting their own message. And then other people sort of turn around and try to use this to say that, well, there's no problem at all. Let's not have this discussion. There is a problem, and we should have the discussion while at the same time pointing out that the RSF report is a bit of a joke.
Kalpana, I think to the last point that Sadanand made, if you can pick up there, one of the arguments that supporters of the Modi government will make is that journalists don't make as much noise when Mamata Banerjee, sends a cartoonist to jail for a mere sort of tune, or a Facebook post in Maharashtra on Sharad Pawar gets a young woman sent to jail. That these are different standards that we absolve. We're soft. When I say we, the media, we the liberal media are soft on parties that are not the BJP when it comes to press freedom.
Barkha, I don't want to get into this whataboutery. I mean, there's too much of it in India. Whatever you say, there'll always be, but why didn't you speak up on this? And why didn't you speak up on that? I think let's concentrate on, the points that Sadanand made, which are very true. Either we talk about the RSF survey and say rubbish it or support it. We cannot, because we don't have anybody from the RSF who will also give us an explanation. Or we talk about the state of press freedom in India today. And to that, I will say there are two things that we've not even touched upon. One is the situation in Kashmir. Of the journalists that have been arrested, a larger number of them are the ones in Kashmir. And Irfan Mehraj was the latest, who just went for questioning to the police station when he was locked up. I know from women journalists I've spoken to that they are afraid when they do a story for an outlet outside Kashmir that they will be summoned to the police station. Many of them have had their passports held up, even if they won an award outside India for which they were supposed to go. When they get to the airport, they're told they're on a no-fly list. This has not happened before. Let me also remind you that the latest thing that the Modi government has done, and that is why I will say it is the Modi government, is they're bringing in a very direct form of censorship through the change that they're bringing into the IT rules, which at the moment are put in abeyance, but they are setting up a fact-checking unit, which is virtually going to decide what we can write about the government. So if we write anything critically, it will be termed as misleading, obviously, by an organization that is located within the government. And I've been through the emergency. I was editing a weekly magazine through it, so I know exactly what censorship is. To me, this is censorship. If you have a government body that is going to decide what you write is misleading or fake or false, and ensure that it doesn't get amplified. So these things have happened in the last 9 years. Let's face up to it. The point is not whether they happened earlier. Of course, they happened earlier. But the point is, at the moment, for any journalist who wants to do their job, and I don't like, by the way, you're clubbing anyone who's critical as activist automatically. No, I'm a professional journalist. My job is to question, and I will question these things. And today, I'm not allowed to do that kind of questioning for which I was trained and which I have been doing all these years. And that is the reality of press. And it's in the absences in the press, the things that do not appear, that you realize what is being kept out. So it's a combination of the overt and the covert. But the covert is the thing that is far more insidious, and it has lulled people into believing that sab kuch changa hai, everything is fine, when actually, legs are being cut.
I just want to say that I certainly do not suggest that any criticism it means that you're politically partisan just on the other side. I just do believe, being from the fraternity as you are, that today we are completely we're expected to be ideologically divided instead of taking a position on issues that our reporting should actually amplify. You're slaughtered as left, right, and I am personally, my training makes me uncomfortable with that, but that's a different debate. I wasn't at all suggesting that anyone who criticizes a government for anything is automatically at the other end of the spectrum. I do have to start taking last comments. Yogendra, Yadav, and then I will give the last word to Dr. Babones, unless anyone else wants to jump in. Yogendra.
I think Sadanand made some very fair points. Initially, our differences look much bigger than they are now. I would agree. I honestly don't want to focus on this comparison between India and Nepal and Afghanistan and Djibouti and so on and so forth. I think, frankly, all over the world, the tools available for that are very, very limited. No tool is perfect. And I don't think we should get into this unless we have, two people who are professionally trained to do this comparison. My focus has been on what is the state of press freedom in India. For me, reports like these, or reports on Freedom House report on democracy, things of that side, for me, these are just occasions to reflect on the serious question on what is the state of media freedom in the country. It is, as Sadanand says, as Kalpana says, I'm sure Professor Salvatore would come around. It is very bad. It is alarming. Any country that calls itself democracy should be very seriously alerted about the condition of the media. And while there are structural reasons which apply all over the world, the biggest reason is the government in power, Modi government. Sadanand makes a very fair point about state governments doing something similar. Bengal, you could speak of other states that he mentioned. You could also mention Aam Aadmi Party government in Punjab, which is doing almost exactly the same. But Sadanand,
sorry, I just want to say for the audience, there's presently a raging battle between media groups and the Punjab government over press freedom, the Aam Aadmi Party government in Punjab, Yogendra. So
I see a linkage between what's happening at the center, because the central government has unleashed this and has got judiciary to kind of okay this, that gives the license to everyone else to be able to do it in their own territory. I'm sure if the central government was a little more careful, a little more non-partisan, if the central government had given a bit of freedom, allowed freedom to the media in this country, I'm sure media in the states would have been able to fight against these state governments in a way, and the judiciary would have come to their support in a way which is much better than is the case. So I see a linkage between what's happening at the state level and at central level. But I agree with you, we should oppose and criticize all of these. And I think as long as we agree, the point that you made and Kalpana made, that in the last few years, there has been a very serious decline in the freedom of Indian media, and that any Indian citizen should be concerned. We have definitely crossed that red line. And that, as long as we agree on that, I don't care whether Afghanistan is on this side of the line or on that side of the line.
Okay, I do have to close. Dr. Babones, before I give you your concluding remark, I'm glad we're talking about state governments, because what all governments do in India, by the way, state and central, right now, is use advertising as a weaponized sort of instrument. It is absolutely commonplace now for governments to withdraw advertising when a critical story against them, this happens both in the states and the center, comes out. And which is why I personally believe that there can be no free press until we address revenues and how newsrooms are to be sustained, because as long as newsrooms remain dependent on government advertising to survive, there's a conflict of interest written into that model. That's my personal opinion. Dr. Babones, last word.
With sincere respect for Sadanand, and especially for the rest of you who actually work in India, as a social scientist, I'm very skeptical of personal experience as a guide to systematic knowledge. I'll just read you one more quote. In a 2021 study, nearly 90% of journalists said they feared, quote, an increase in threats, harassment, or intimidation, starting with threats from the government. That from the RSF report for Australia.
Okay, so if you had to conclude, you did, I know, in your own way, but if you had to just give a closing comment on the larger discussion on media freedom, have you looked at that more closely? Sadanand, are you trying to come in there with a
let him go first.
point? Dr. Babones, Dr. Babones, did you want to add to your concluding remark?
We can't use personal experience as a guide to systematic knowledge. We have to go to the numbers. And on the only numbers we have available, India performs remarkably well for a poor country and remarkably well for a poor democracy.
Okay, Sadanand, I have to close after this, please.
Yes, I just want to sort of leave with one thought, right? I think part of the problem is that people expect these measurements to be scientific measurements, but it's better to sort of see these as kind of like, think of us as movie critics. Now, you could be right sometimes, you could be wrong sometimes, but I think the world generally agrees that Citizen Kane was a more significant and better movie than Kabhi Khushi Kabhi Gham. And I think therefore, we have a general sense. Audiences can make up their own mind. I personally would take the views of someone like Kalpana very seriously, as I would take the views of other people who have been in the trenches of Indian journalism. Everyone may bring their own bias to it, and we should be upfront about that. But I do take it very seriously. And I think I think that there's something disingenuous about trying to simply bat away the lived experience of many journalists. You can disagree with it, but I mean, when the evidence and the anecdotal evidence is as stark as it is, as the examples you gave also, Barkha, I think it's sort of, it's not very productive to sort of say that if you can't measure it with a set of calipers, it simply means nothing.
Okay, we leave it there. The debate carries on. Kalpana said nobody had actually looked at this debate. Well, at least we've started it. We hope others will pick it up and there will be more robust conversations around it. I also hope at some point, I know I'm a broken record here. Everybody's only talking with the politics. I really believe globally media is in a crisis because news is finding a struggle to pay for itself. And that's where all of your conflicts with business and politics actually begin. But leaving it there, Sadanand, Kalpana, Yogendra and Salvatore, thank you so much. And to our audience, thank you and see you tomorrow.
It's great to see you here. Thank you for watching our work. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to Mojo Story and support independent, robust journalism.